"You don't own this street," she snapped, voice sharp across the cul-de-sac. And that was the moment everything changed. The smell of freshly cut grass and the faint aroma of asphalt from the nearby road mixed with my coffee, still warm in my hand, as I stepped out of my truck onto the gravel driveway. My name is Ethan Carter, 35 years old, software engineer by trade, newly returned to the neighborhood I had just inherited, and for the past few hours, it all felt surreal. The sun hit the tops of the maple trees lining the street, casting long shadows that danced over the freshly mowed lawns, each one neat, each one identical in its precision, a perfect demonstration of what the HOA demanded. Across from me, Karen Whitmore, the self-appointed president of Willowbrook Estates HOA, was already on her phone, pacing, her heels clicking sharply against the concrete of her driveway, papers flapping in the wind like small flags of authority. Her Lexus gleamed in the sun, a stark contrast to my old F-150, which bore the dust of 100 miles driven to check on the property. She had that practiced smile that hid everything, a kind of sweetness that made your stomach tense, the kind that said, "I am in charge, and you will follow." I watched as she barked orders to her neighbor, gesturing toward the property line, a line that for generations had belonged to my family, now under my name, though she had no idea yet. The tension in the air was tangible. The faint hum of a lawn mower somewhere in the distance, the buzz of cicadas from the oak trees, and the distant bark of a dog formed a soundtrack to the confrontation about to unfold. I felt my hand brush against the thick leather of the folder I carried. Inside every document that mattered, deeds, contracts, proof of ownership, silent weapons in a legal battlefield she hadn't even seen coming. Karen's voice rose again, sharp and precise, reciting HOA bylaws and fines as if those pieces of paper somehow gave her authority over every inch of land I now legally controlled. I kept my eyes on her, noting the curl of her lips, the way her hand trembled slightly while holding the phone, betraying the confidence she tried so hard to project. The metallic taste of anticipation coated my tongue as I inhaled the crisp morning air, feeling the weight of decades of family legacy settle squarely on my shoulders. The gate to the property had been left open, the gravel shifting slightly underfoot as I moved forward, my boots crunching in a rhythm that matched the quickening beat of my heart. I could hear the faint scratching of a pen against paper from across the street as she scribbled notes, presumably to call the police again, to cite another violation that didn't exist, her authority imagined, but for a moment appearing unassailable. I reminded myself of the countless hours spent researching every clause, every loophole, every technicality that could turn this moment in my favor. Each step on the driveway was a silent drumbeat in a plan that had been building quietly, carefully, like a trap set for a predator. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of her perfume mixed with the faint tang of morning dew, a sensory reminder of the clash between meticulous control and lawful ownership. I opened the folder slowly, letting the paper shift, the soft rustle a subtle counterpoint to her escalating frustration. The neighbors peeked from behind curtains and fences, curious but cautious, sensing the growing tension, unaware that the man they had seen arrive earlier that week was not only a resident, but now the rightful authority over the land and its rules. Karen paused, mid-sentence, staring at me with a flicker of doubt crossing her face, the first hint that she might realize she had miscalculated, though she didn't yet understand the full scope. My gaze swept the boundary markers, the old oak stump with my initials carved decades ago, the small earth berm that had guided rainwater for generations, all silent witnesses to the legitimacy of my claim. I felt the sun warm the nape of my neck. The wind tugged gently at the corners of my jacket, and I knew the moment to act was near, but not yet. Each movement, each sound, each subtle gesture was part of a cinematic build-up that only I could see, a story unfolding in real time where patience and precision were as powerful as any confrontation. My voice remained calm, low, deliberate, as I finally spoke. Karen, the deeds have changed hands. This street, this land, is mine. Her eyes widened, the phone lowered slightly, a flicker of panic mingled with disbelief, but she tried to maintain control, her words fumbling as she searched for authority she no longer had. The smell of freshly baked bread from a nearby kitchen wafted faintly through the air, juxtaposing domestic normalcy against the brewing storm of realization. I could see her pulse quicken, the subtle tightening of her jaw, the crease forming between her brows, all indicators of someone confronting a truth they had not anticipated. I took a measured step forward, the gravel crunching underfoot echoing through the quiet street, my shadow stretching toward her as if to remind her of the inevitable shift in power. The distant rumble of a passing truck mixed with the chirping of birds, layering sound over tension, grounding the moment in reality while heightening suspense. Every eye along the street lingered on the unfolding scene, neighbors unsure whether to intervene or merely witness the unraveling of HOA authority. And as Karen stuttered, searching for a response, for a command she could still enforce, I let the weight of silence do its work, knowing the law, the legacy, and the evidence were all aligned on my side. My hand hovered over the folder, ready, precise, the culmination of hours spent understanding every clause, anticipating every move. And just as she seemed to muster a final retort, a delivery truck rounded the corner, its engine growl punctuating the suspense, and I felt the morning stretch, the seconds dilate, each one amplifying the anticipation of what would happen next. The morning air settled into a crisp rhythm, carrying the faint scent of cedar from the nearby trees and the lingering aroma of freshly cut grass from the yards lining Willowbrook Estates. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of responsibility that came with inheriting this land, knowing that each step I took along the gravel path mattered more than it appeared. My boots crunched lightly against the small stones, a sound that reminded me of countless mornings spent walking the property with my father, learning the contours of the land and the significance of each boundary marker. Across the street, Karen Whitmore was still fuming, her phone pressed tightly against her ear as she barked orders to some unseen person, her high heels clicking in a hurried rhythm that seemed to echo the anxiety simmering just below her controlled demeanor. I adjusted the strap of the folder in my hand, feeling the embossed leather and the smooth, cool pages inside, each document a testament to hours of careful research, the deeds, the contracts, every clause examined and cross-referenced, ready to affirm my authority at the perfect moment. I could see her lips moving, speaking words I could not quite hear, gestures sharp and deliberate, a clear attempt to assert control over what she believed belonged to her. Yet her confidence had begun to waver, subtle tremors in her posture betraying the first signs of doubt. The sun climbed higher, illuminating the neatly trimmed lawns and the row of houses that represented her imagined dominion, each one polished and identical, a physical manifestation of the order she tried so desperately to maintain. My gaze swept over the scene, noting the small details, the faded paint on her mailbox, the slight lean of the decorative lamppost, the worn stones along the edge of her driveway, all silent witnesses to the incongruities in her claims. I stepped closer to the property line, feeling the soft give of the earth beneath my boots, each step measured, deliberate, a cadence that matched the careful preparation that had led me to this day. The wind shifted, carrying with it the faint scent of asphalt from the road beyond the neighborhood and a distant hum from a lawn mower, layering the sensory elements of the morning with tension and anticipation. I opened the folder slightly, allowing the rustle of the pages to break the stillness, a subtle signal that I was prepared, that the law and the legacy it represented were on my side. Karen glanced up, eyes narrowing, sensing movement, and for the first time, I detected hesitation in her gaze, a flicker that suggested she realized her assumed authority was not absolute. I took a deep, steadying breath, recalling every lesson my father had imparted about patience, observation, and timing, the importance of knowing when to act and when to let events unfold naturally. My hand lingered on the top page of the folder, feeling the embossed seal, the weight of verification, knowing that this tangible proof of ownership was far more powerful than any shouted order or imaginary citation she could muster. I noticed the subtle shift in her stance as she realized that her audience, the neighbors watching quietly from behind windows and fences, were starting to question her assertiveness, the curiosity in their eyes a silent testimony to the unfolding power dynamic. The sunlight glinted off the folder's corners, catching the faintest shimmer and drawing a line between preparation and action, a visual metaphor for the legal and procedural edge I held. I moved slowly along the gravel, boots pressing into the earth, listening to the distant bird calls and the faint creak of a gate swinging in the breeze, each sound amplifying the anticipation that coiled in the space between us. Karen's phone call ended abruptly, her hand dropping slightly as she seemed to measure the reality of her position, her previous certainty now replaced by a subtle but unmistakable tension. I let my gaze drift over the familiar landmarks of the property, the old oak stump engraved with my initials, the slight rise of the earth where rainwater had always pooled, the small decorative fence that had guided generations before me, each detail reinforcing the legitimacy of my claim. I felt the morning warmth against my back, the wind tugged gently at my jacket, and the quiet expectation that comes just before an inevitable confrontation. Every motion, every glance, every rustle of paper was part of a rhythm I had rehearsed silently, a narrative that played out in real time, cinematic in its unfolding, and entirely under my control. And as Karen began to speak again, her words sharp but faltering, I held the folder slightly higher, the leather cool against my palm, letting the anticipation build to the precise moment when everything would pivot. The street seemed to hold its breath, the distant hum of traffic and the soft buzz of cicadas forming a backdrop to the unspoken drama, neighbors frozen in their windows, sensing the imminent revelation. And just as she lifted her hand to emphasize her point, the morning light glinting across the documents in my grasp, I let the weight of silence stretch, letting it speak louder than any argument, knowing the next move would change everything. Karen Whitmore hesitated, her eyes scanning the papers I held, as the realization slowly crept across her features that the authority she thought she possessed was nothing more than an illusion. The morning sun glinted off the metal edges of the mailbox posts, casting long shadows across the gravel drive and illuminating the neatly lined hedges that separated each property like silent witnesses to this confrontation. I could hear the faint hum of an air conditioner from the house across the street, the subtle rustle of leaves in the breeze, and the distant bark of a dog. All ordinary, sounds contrasting sharply with the tension building between us. I adjusted my grip on the folder, feeling the weight of the documents, each page meticulously organized to affirm ownership, every clause double-checked against the county records, and the embossed seal pressed firmly into the top sheet, like a quiet statement of authority. Karen's lips pressed together in a thin line, her posture rigid, her hands gripping the phone so tightly that the knuckles shone white under the morning light. She had been preparing for a confrontation, rehearsing lines, citations, and threats, but the calm in my demeanor was a counterweight to every expected escalation. The gravel shifted under my boots as I moved slowly along the boundary line, every step intentional, measuring distance and perspective, aware that each neighbor peeking through blinds or over fences was now a part of the unspoken audience. The air was crisp, carrying with it the scent of morning dew, freshly mowed grass, and the faint tang of asphalt from the street beyond, sensory markers that anchored the scene in reality while amplifying the suspense of the unfolding moment. I took a deep breath, letting the cool air fill my lungs and steady my pulse, my eyes never leaving hers as she seemed to wrestle internally with the shift in power. The folder rustled softly as I shifted it slightly, a subtle sound that drew her attention and caused her to glance downward, just long enough for the subtle flicker of uncertainty to register in her expression. Her phone buzzed insistently in her other hand, an incoming call she ignored, unable to reconcile the imagined authority with the irrefutable proof now resting in front of me. I noticed the small details, the slight sag of her shoes against the pavement, the tension in her shoulders, the way her fingers flexed unconsciously around the papers, each tiny motion betraying the storm of calculations happening in her mind. The sunlight reflected off the folder, highlighting the embossed seal, and I felt the weight of my ancestors' diligence, the countless hours spent maintaining and protecting this property, lending gravity to every moment. I stepped closer to the edge of the gravel path, the tiny stones crunching beneath my feet, a sound that seemed amplified in the quiet morning, and I felt the rhythm of preparation and anticipation, the careful alignment of timing and positioning that made the difference between a successful assertion and chaos. The neighbors remained silently observant, their curiosity muted by caution, as the spatial dynamics of the street shifted subtly under the presence of authority, law, and heritage embodied in my stance. I allowed a few moments of silence to settle over the confrontation, the kind of pause that magnifies attention, lets the mind wander into possibilities, and heightens the awareness of stakes without a single word being spoken. Karen's gaze darted toward the mailbox, then the decorative fence, then back at me, a dance of calculated glances as she tried to reconcile what she had always assumed with the undeniable reality in front of her. The faint whistle of the wind carried a note of tension, and the shifting shadows of the maple trees overhead seemed to stretch across the street like silent observers noting the changing tides of control. I could feel the sun warming my back, the leather of the folder slightly warming under my hand, a tactile reminder of the tangible proof I possessed and the meticulous care taken to ensure that every detail was correct, lawful, and undeniable. Her breathing quickened subtly, a barely perceptible rhythm in contrast to my measured, calm inhalations, and I knew the moment of impact was approaching, the instant when her confidence would meet the weight of legitimacy. Each small sound, the crunch of gravel, the faint hum of distant traffic, the soft rustling of leaves, was accentuated by the heightened focus, lending cinematic clarity to the scene unfolding before both of us. I shifted the folder just enough to catch the sunlight fully, the seal glinting, and her head tilted slightly as if trying to read my intention in the movement. The street held a quiet tension, neighbors frozen in attention, the world seeming to contract around the space between us, the anticipation stretching in measured increments. I let the silence linger, knowing that this quiet dominance, paired with the tangible authority in my hands, was the most effective statement I could make without uttering a single confrontational word. And as Karen opened her mouth again, the subtle tremor in her voice hinted at a realization beginning to form, a recognition that the ground had shifted beneath her feet. The morning had shifted slightly, the sunlight now filtering through the maple leaves in long, dappled patterns across the gravel driveway, illuminating each small stone, each subtle contour of the terrain that had been under my family's care for generations. I adjusted the folder under my arm, feeling the embossed seal press lightly into my palm, a quiet reassurance of the legitimacy resting within its pages. Karen Whitmore was pacing now, her steps crisp and precise, heels clicking sharply against the concrete edge of her driveway, phone held tightly as she spoke in clipped sentences, attempting to gather support or perhaps stall the inevitable. The distant hum of a lawn mower, the occasional rustle of leaves, and the soft chatter of birds provided a natural cadence against the tension that built with each passing second. I took a careful step closer to the property line, feeling the subtle give of the earth beneath my boots, gravel crunching in a rhythm that matched the anticipation in the air. My eyes swept the familiar landmarks, the old oak stump, slightly weathered, carved with the initials my father had etched decades before, the small berm guiding runoff water during storms, and the decorative fence bordering the neighboring lot, all silent witnesses to the impending revelation. Karen's hands tightened around her phone as she realized her audience. The neighbors peeking through blinds and over fences were now actively observing, their curiosity mingling with a quiet tension that seemed to stretch across the street. I allowed a small rustle of the papers in the folder to punctuate the silence, a deliberate signal of preparedness that made her glance down, a fleeting flicker of doubt in her expression betraying the confidence she had projected moments before. I breathed deeply, the crisp air filling my lungs, tasting faint hints of asphalt from the nearby street and the earthy scent of morning dew on grass, grounding the cinematic tension in tangible reality. Every line in the folder, every clause verified against county records, every document double-checked for accuracy, represented more than just legal proof. It was the culmination of decades of stewardship, preparation, and quiet observation, a tangible manifestation of authority that required no shouting to assert itself. Karen paused mid-sentence, her shoulders tightening, jaw set, and for the first time, I noticed her gaze flicker with uncertainty, the slight shift of her weight, the subtle twitch of her fingers betraying internal calculations. Of a rapidly changing scenario, I moved a measured step forward, gravel crunching beneath my boots, the tactile feedback synchronizing with the rhythm of anticipation, the soft hum of distant traffic and the creak of a gate swinging in the breeze, forming a natural soundscape against the unfolding drama. The sun glinted off the edges of the folder, highlighting the embossed seal, catching her attention in a way that underscored the shift of authority. Neighbors remained quietly observant, their heads tilted, silent acknowledgement of a moment where reality was about to confront assumption. I could sense the weight of generations behind me, the decades of careful maintenance and protection lending gravity to each movement, each gesture, each pause in this quiet standoff. Karen's phone vibrated again, an incoming call she ignored, unable to reconcile her assumed dominance with the undeniable presence of legitimate control in front of her. I adjusted my stance slightly, letting the shift in posture convey readiness and quiet confidence, the subtle movements of the folder reinforcing the tangible evidence I held without needing to speak further. The air seemed to thicken, every sound, the crunch of gravel, the distant bird song, the soft sighing of wind through leaves, amplifying the focus, highlighting the shift in dynamics that neither words nor gestures alone could achieve. I let a moment of silence hang, allowing the weight of legitimacy and careful preparation to fill the space, knowing that the tension alone was a powerful communicator of authority. Karen's eyes darted from the folder to the property line, then to the distant fences, a silent negotiation in her gaze, trying to measure the extent of control she had lost before the full impact became undeniable. I could feel the warmth of the sun, the leather of the folder under my arm, and the subtle shift of air around us, each sensory detail amplifying the cinematic clarity of the moment, a perfect storm of anticipation and restrained action. The neighbors remained frozen in observation, a quiet audience to the subtle power dynamics at play, as I prepared to assert the final piece of authority at just the right moment. And as Karen straightened, the slight tremor in her posture suggesting the first recognition of the unfolding reality, I readied myself to demonstrate what quiet, precise control could accomplish when matched with evidence, timing, and patience. The sun climbed higher, casting golden light across the neatly lined driveways and manicured lawns, accentuating the contrast between control and ownership, between assumed authority and proven legality. I adjusted the folder in my hands, letting the papers shift slightly with a soft rustle that drew Karen Whitmore's eyes for a brief moment, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her expression. My gaze swept the surrounding houses, noting the subtle differences, the worn edges on her mailbox, the small cracks in the decorative stone pillars, evidence that not everything in her domain was flawless, and a reminder that control can be fragile when measured against legitimacy. The gravel beneath my boots shifted slightly as I took a careful step, each crunch a reminder of the passage of time and the weight of preparation. Karen's phone buzzed again, and she glanced at it instinctively, her focus momentarily divided, giving me a fraction of space to assert presence without speaking. The air carried the faint scent of fresh mulch from the flower beds along her fence line, mingling with the earthy aroma of damp soil from the morning dew, grounding the tension in tangible reality. I could feel the history of the property beneath me, every inch of earth shaped and maintained by generations of careful stewardship, and I understood the responsibility that came with it, the patience, the observation, the timing required to navigate a delicate confrontation. Karen's posture remained rigid, shoulders squared, hands clutching her phone and a set of HOA papers, her voice rising slightly as she attempted to assert her imagined authority, the cadence clipped, precise, rehearsed. I watched her, noting the subtle quiver in her fingers, the faint shifting of her weight from foot to foot, the micro-expressions that betrayed the cracks in her confidence. The soft hum of a passing car down the street, the distant chirping of birds, the rustling of leaves in the breeze. All ordinary sounds layered against the extraordinary tension that hung over the property line. I let the folder shift in my grip again, a barely perceptible movement, and her eyes flicked down involuntarily, betraying a recognition of the tangible evidence of ownership that she could not dismiss. The sunlight glinted off the embossed seal, highlighting the authority resting within the pages, a quiet but undeniable assertion that required no loud declaration. I stepped slightly closer to the boundary, boots pressing into the gravel in a deliberate rhythm, measuring space, timing, and attention. Each movement precise and intentional, a subtle dance of presence and preparation. Karen's lips parted slightly, a hesitation she tried to mask with a curt gesture toward her phone, her eyes scanning the assembled neighborhood, silently observing from behind windows and fences, their attention drawn to the unfolding demonstration of rightful authority. The wind carried a faint note of asphalt from the street beyond, the soft hum of distant machinery from early morning landscaping, and the gentle cooing of birds, sounds that underscored the contrast between ordinary suburban life and the extraordinary assertion of control in this quiet confrontation. I allowed a few moments of silence to settle, letting the weight of patience, preparation, and legal standing fill the space between us, a quiet pressure that spoke louder than any shouted command. Her gaze darted repeatedly from the folder to the property line, to the fences, to the neighbors watching silently, and I could see the calculations forming in her mind, an internal negotiation of how much she had overstepped and the implications of that realization. The morning warmth settled against my back, the texture of the folder smooth and solid in my hands, and the subtle shift in air currents amplified the cinematic clarity of the moment, each small detail magnified in the tension. I could sense the anticipation building, not just in her, but in the street, in the watchful eyes of the quiet audience, in the hushed movements of the day, all of it converging into a single point where proof, presence, and patience would converge. I moved the folder slightly higher, letting a small reflection catch her peripheral vision, an unspoken reminder that the weight of evidence and authority was balanced entirely on my side, unflinching, undeniable. Karen adjusted her stance, a micro shift in posture betraying the first real acknowledgement of what she faced, her confidence tempered by the subtle but pervasive assertion of legality. The gravel shifted underfoot as I took another careful step, each one deliberate, measured, the ambient sounds around us forming a natural score to the tension building in the driveway. And as she opened her mouth to speak, I let the silence stretch, letting the weight of preparation, observation, and undeniable authority speak before a single word was uttered. As the morning edged toward noon, the sunlight shifted, casting elongated patterns through the maple leaves, illuminating the gravel driveway in a soft, golden haze that made every detail of the land stand out more sharply. I adjusted the folder in my hands, feeling the embossed seal press gently against my palm, a tactile reminder of the legal authority I now possessed, each page inside meticulously verified, every clause checked against county records. Karen Whitmore continued pacing, her high heels clicking sharply against the concrete, her phone intermittently pressed to her ear as she muttered under her breath, the sound mingling with the faint hum of a distant lawn mower and the soft rustle of leaves overhead. I stepped closer to the property line, gravel crunching under my boots, each measured step a reflection of preparation and observation, every small motion intended to reinforce my presence and the quiet dominance I held. My eyes swept across the familiar boundaries, the old oak stump carved with my initials, the small decorative fence, the subtle slope guiding rainwater, all markers that underscored the legitimacy of my ownership, tangible evidence that contrasted with the imagined authority Karen wielded. The neighbors remained quietly observant, peeking through blinds or leaning slightly over fences, sensing the shift in dynamic. Curiosity mingled with cautious anticipation, their attention drawn to the unfolding demonstration of rightful control. The air carried the faint tang of asphalt from the nearby street, mingling with the earthy scent of freshly cut grass, layering sensory clarity over the tension that stretched between us. Karen's lips pressed together, her jaw tight, and I noted the slight tremor in her hands gripping the phone, subtle but undeniable signs of internal recalculation, her once confident demeanor beginning to waver. I allowed a soft rustle of the papers in the folder to punctuate the silence, drawing her eyes downward momentarily, the movement small but precise, emphasizing the evidence resting in my hands. The sunlight glinted off the embossed seal, catching her peripheral vision, a quiet, reflective assertion of authority that needed no vocal reinforcement. I moved another step, boots pressing into the gravel with deliberate rhythm, feeling the slight give of the earth beneath, each motion a reinforcement of readiness and patient control. Karen's gaze darted repeatedly between the folder, the property markers, and the observing neighbors, an unspoken calculation forming, her body language betraying the first inklings of uncertainty as the weight of lawful ownership settled into the scene. The distant hum of morning activity, the occasional passing car, birdsong, and the soft sigh of wind through trees formed an ambient soundtrack, ordinary yet emphasizing the extraordinary nature of the confrontation. I allowed a few beats of silence, letting anticipation build, each second stretching with the quiet gravity of inevitable revelation, the kind that communicates more powerfully than words or gestures alone. Her stance shifted subtly, a small tilt of the head, a pause in her steps, a micro-expression of awareness that her claims were no longer grounded in reality. I could feel the warmth of the sun on my back, the smooth texture of the folder in my hand, and the careful alignment of preparation, observation, and documentation coming together into a single, controlled assertion of authority. Every motion, every glance, every soft rustle of the folder contributed to a rhythm that held the attention of everyone present, neighbors silently registering the shift in power as the street itself seemed to lean in, holding its breath. Karen's eyes narrowed briefly, scanning for support, for some point of leverage that no longer existed. Her confidence strained under the weight of undeniable proof and the calm, deliberate presence I maintained. I let the folder tilt slightly, catching the sunlight in a subtle glint, a visual punctuation to the growing tension, a quiet declaration of readiness, legal grounding, and patience. The gravel underfoot shifted faintly with my stance adjustments, the ambient morning sounds layering over the heightened focus, creating a cinematic clarity that underscored every subtle interaction. And as Karen opened her mouth to speak again, searching for a line of authority she could still assert, I held the folder just slightly higher, the embossed seal catching the sun, letting the quiet dominance speak louder than any words could convey. The afternoon sun had shifted to the western side of the sky, casting elongated shadows that traced the contours of the driveway and the gentle slopes of the surrounding lawns, highlighting every subtle bump and curve of the property I now controlled. I felt the folder weigh a little heavier in my hands, not from its physical mass, but from the significance contained within every carefully reviewed page, every clause validated against decades of county records. Karen Whitmore's posture had become noticeably tense, the earlier confidence replaced by the careful calibration of someone measuring the limits of influence in the face of undeniable proof. Her phone lay forgotten at her side for a moment as she watched, the gestures and glances of her small entourage frozen in recognition of a moment where authority shifted from imagined to documented. I stepped lightly along the gravel, boots pressing into the tiny stones with a rhythm that matched the quiet cadence of observation, letting every motion communicate readiness, calm, and patience rather than force. The wind carried the faint aroma of freshly baked bread from a nearby kitchen and the lingering smell of lawn fertilizer, grounding the tension in a tangible, almost ordinary sensory backdrop, making the confrontation feel cinematic yet real. Each feature of the property, the old oak stump engraved with initials, the slight rise in the earth forming a natural berm, the edges of decorative stonework marking boundaries, acted as silent witnesses to the legitimacy of my claim, every detail reinforcing the shift in control. Karen's hands twitched slightly, a micro-expression betraying the effort to maintain composure, to gather words that would not contradict the slowly dawning reality that her authority was being quietly dismantled by law and preparation rather than confrontation. I shifted the folder slightly higher, the embossed seal catching the sunlight in a sharp glint, drawing attention to the undeniable proof of ownership resting firmly within, a visual assertion that required no spoken argument. The gravel beneath my boots shifted faintly as I repositioned myself, each small movement a subtle, deliberate reinforcement of presence and readiness, a measured choreography to assert legal dominance without raising my voice. Karen's gaze moved repeatedly from the folder to the property markers, the hedges lining the street, and the neighbors quietly observing from behind windows and fences, each glance a silent negotiation with reality, measuring what authority remained versus what had been legally reestablished. The soundscape, the distant hum of morning traffic, the soft buzz of cicadas, the whispering whine through the leaves, contrasted with the concentrated tension in the driveway, providing an ambient clarity that heightened the significance of each small gesture, each subtle interaction. I allowed a moment of silence to stretch, letting anticipation and the weight of preparation fill the space between us, emphasizing that authority grounded in legal proof and careful stewardship outweighed any performance of imagined power. Karen's shoulders shifted minutely, a barely perceptible tilt that signaled the first real acknowledgement of her miscalculation, a recognition that her claims could not override the documented truth in front of her. The sun continued its descent, casting longer shadows across the neighborhood and drawing attention to the subtle details of the property that I had so meticulously maintained, reinforcing the tangible proof of rightful ownership. I felt the weight of legacy, of patient research and careful observation, as a quiet current beneath my movements, guiding each step, each tilt of the folder, each glance exchanged, a rhythm that communicated control without words. Her eyes flicked repeatedly between the papers, the property line, and the observing neighbors, internal calculations visible in micro-expressions that betrayed the unraveling of assumed authority. The distant calls of birds and the faint hum of a passing car seemed amplified in their significance, marking each passing second with cinematic tension, a natural soundtrack underscoring the slow, deliberate shift in power. I tilted the folder ever so slightly, the sunlight catching the embossed seal in a way that demanded attention, a subtle visual cue that authority rested firmly on my side. Every micro-detail, the shifting gravel, the slight tension in her fingers, the quiet attention of the neighbors, converged to create a moment of clarity, of inevitability, where patience, preparation, and legal documentation held sway. And as Karen opened her mouth again, searching for leverage that no longer existed, I allowed the weight of evidence, timing, and quiet control to speak on my behalf. Every gesture, every subtle motion a statement of power that needed no amplification. The late afternoon light had turned warm, golden, casting long shadows across the meticulously maintained lawns and gravel driveway, highlighting the subtle contours of the property that had been the center of contention. I adjusted the folder in my hand, feeling the embossed seal press gently, a reminder of the authority and preparation contained within, each page cross-checked against county records and legal documentation, forming an unassailable foundation. Karen Whitmore stood a few steps away, her posture rigid, eyes narrowing as she scanned the folder and then the land, searching for any point of leverage, any perceived error she could exploit, but finding none. The neighbors peeked silently through blinds and over fences, their curiosity mounting as the tension between imagined and legitimate authority unfolded with deliberate clarity. I took a deliberate step along the gravel path, boots pressing into the stones, each crunch underscoring my presence, each movement measured and intentional, a choreography of control designed to reinforce the legal and rightful standing I held. Karen shifted slightly, adjusting, her grip on the phone and the stack of HOA papers, lips pressed tightly together, a micro-expression betraying the realization that her assertions of dominance were no longer grounded in reality. The scent of freshly cut grass mingled with the faint tang of asphalt from the street beyond, sensory details anchoring the moment in the familiar yet charged environment, each breath filling my lungs with a sense of measured purpose. I allowed the folder to shift slightly, the subtle rustle of pages drawing her gaze downward, a visual assertion of preparedness and evidence that required no spoken word. Sunlight glinted off the embossed seal, catching Karen's peripheral vision, a quiet but undeniable signal that authority now rested firmly in my hands, supported by decades of stewardship and documentation. The soft hum of a distant lawn mower, the gentle rustle of leaves, and the occasional chirp of birds created a natural soundtrack against the heightened focus, grounding the cinematic moment in reality while amplifying the tension. I moved a few more deliberate steps closer to the property line, gravel shifting beneath my boots, aligning presence, timing, and observation with precise intent. Karen's eyes darted repeatedly between the folder, the property markers, and the silent neighbors watching, each glance an unspoken negotiation of the shifting balance of authority. Every detail of the property, the old oak stump with carved initials, the gentle rise of the berm, the edges of the decorative fence, served as tangible proof of rightful ownership, each feature reinforcing the credibility of my presence and preparation. The warmth of the late afternoon sun settled on my back, the leather of the folder smooth and cool under my hand, and I felt the rhythm of observation, timing, and patience converge into a moment where subtle presence communicated more powerfully than any declaration. Karen's micro-expressions, the twitch of a finger, the shift in shoulders, the fleeting tightening around her phone, spoke volumes, betraying her recognition of a reality she could no longer contest. I let a measured silence hang in the air, allowing anticipation, preparation, and undeniable evidence to fill the space, communicating control without uttering a word. The ambient sounds of the neighborhood, the distant hum of cars, the whispering wind through leaves, the faint cooing of birds, amplified the cinematic quality of the unfolding confrontation, layering tension over familiarity. I subtly tilted the folder, catching the sunlight in a glint that drew Karen's eyes once more, a visual cue that every claim she had made could be countered with documented authority. The neighbors remained quiet observers, their attention drawn to the deliberate interplay of presence and preparation, the silent assertion of law and stewardship replacing the previous assumptions of dominance. I allowed the moment to stretch, emphasizing the weight of legacy, careful observation, and methodical preparation, every small gesture reinforcing the shift in control. Karen exhaled softly, a subtle sign of recalibration, as she realized her previous authority was now contingent upon the documentation and deliberate actions standing before her. The gravel beneath my boots shifted slightly as I adjusted stance, preparing to demonstrate the next step in the assertion of rightful control, every motion precise and intentional. And as Karen opened her mouth again, the pause, the hesitation, and the subtle tremor in her voice hinted at the acknowledgement forming, the quiet surrender of imagined dominance to the reality established through patience, preparation, and legal clarity. The sun had begun its slow descent, bathing the neighborhood in a warm, amber glow that stretched long shadows across the gravel driveway and neatly trimmed lawns, marking the close of a day that had shifted the balance of authority irrevocably. I felt the weight of the folder in my hands, the embossed seal reflecting the soft light, each page inside a testament to preparation, observation, and legal proof, a tangible culmination of hours spent aligning facts, documents, and timing to establish control. Karen Whitmore's posture had softened slightly, her earlier rigidity giving way to the subtle signs of acknowledgement, a tilt of the head, a shift in weight, a quiet admission that the authority she had presumed was no longer hers to wield. I stepped slowly forward, boots pressing into the gravel with careful rhythm, each movement deliberate, measured, and grounded in confidence. The crunch underfoot a subtle reminder of the presence I had established. The gentle rustle of leaves in the breeze, the distant hum of traffic on the far street, and the occasional call of birds formed a natural backdrop to the cinematic clarity of the confrontation, each ordinary sound emphasizing the extraordinary shift taking place in the driveway. I adjusted the folder slightly, letting it catch the sunlight in a sharp glint, drawing Karen's gaze once more to the physical evidence of ownership that she could not refute, each document a quiet assertion of power grounded in law and legacy. The neighbors continued to watch silently from behind windows and fences, their curiosity transformed into an awareness of the re-established balance, the subtle dynamics of observation and presence marking a public acknowledgement of rightful authority. I allowed a pause, letting the weight of patience, planning, and meticulous preparation fill the space, a quiet tension that communicated control without a single word, the rhythm of anticipation accentuating every gesture and microexpression. Karen's eyes flicked repeatedly from the folder to the property line, to the subtle markers along the edges of the lawn, and finally to the observing neighbors, her previous certainty tempered by the recognition that the legal and procedural groundwork beneath my hands was unassailable. I inhaled deeply, the crisp evening air carrying the faint aroma of mulch, fresh-cut grass, and the distant tang of asphalt, anchoring the scene in reality while the cinematic tension remained fully intact, each sensory detail heightening focus. My gaze swept across the familiar features, the old oak stump, the small decorative fence, the berms shaping the landscape, all carefully maintained and silently affirming ownership, each element a visual cue to the legitimacy I now commanded. Karen shifted slightly, fingers flexing around her phone, lips pressed together, a micro-expression betraying contemplation and the dawning realization that her previous strategies held no power against evidence, and timing aligned perfectly in my favor. I stepped closer to the center of the driveway, letting the gravel shift underfoot, a subtle but precise motion that reinforced presence, preparation, and control without the need for escalation or confrontation. The ambient sounds of the street, the soft buzz of a passing car, distant lawn mowers, and wind whispering through leaves, accentuated the cinematic quality of the moment, grounding it in familiar suburban life while amplifying the gravity of the subtle but undeniable shift in power. I allowed the folder to rest lightly against my chest for a moment, feeling the embossed seal press gently, a tactile reminder of the meticulous care, observation, and planning that had led to this conclusive moment. Karen's eyes met mine, a mixture of incredulity and reluctant acknowledgement passing across her expression, the silent concession that the balance of authority had shifted and that the legal and procedural foundation I held could not be contested. I felt the warmth of the late afternoon sun against my back, the slight breeze tugging at my jacket, and the quiet attention of the neighbors forming a peripheral audience, each subtle detail reinforcing the inevitability of what had been quietly established throughout the day. The rustle of the folder, the shift of my boots on the gravel, and the ambient soundtrack of ordinary suburban life created a cinematic rhythm, highlighting the precise and patient approach that had led to this culmination. I tilted the folder slightly, letting the sunlight catch the seal, and held my stance, the embodiment of calm authority, measured presence, and unshakable preparation, each detail of motion and observation reinforcing the undeniable reality of ownership. Karen exhaled softly, a nearly imperceptible gesture, and stepped back, her posture relaxed yet unmistakably signaling the acceptance of what had been documented and demonstrated throughout the day. I allowed the moment to linger, the street quiet, shadows stretching longer, a subtle wind moving through leaves, every sensory element emphasizing that control, when grounded in patience, evidence, and careful timing, spoke louder than words. And as the sun continued to lower, casting a final amber glow across the property, I knew the authority established today would hold, solid and unquestioned, leaving the imagined dominance of HOA leadership behind in the dust.